The shuttle from Earth to the orbital station Horizon 7 was packed with passengers that Tuesday morning. Maya Collins sat in seat 12A with her tablet resting on the small tray table in front of her. She was 26 years old with dark skin that glowed under the cabin lights, and her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She wore simple jeans and a plain jacket because she did not want to stand out or draw any attention to herself. The flight was supposed to take 3 hours, and she had plenty of work to do during that time. Around her, the other passengers were settling into their seats and putting their bags in the overhead compartments. Some were business people heading to the lunar colonies to make deals and sign contracts. Others were scientists traveling to Mars research facilities to study rocks and soil samples. There were also families visiting relatives who worked in the deep space mining operations far from Earth. Maya had flown this route before, and she knew it was usually smooth and uneventful. She opened a file on her tablet and began reading through the information she had collected over the past few weeks. The data was interesting, and it painted a clear picture of what was happening on these commercial space flights. She made notes as she read and occasionally glanced up to watch the other passengers boarding the shuttle. An older man in a business suit took the seat across the aisle from her. A young couple with a baby sat 2 rows ahead. A group of college students laughed and joked as they found their seats near the back. Everyone seemed normal and relaxed as they prepared for the journey ahead. Captain Derek Hayes was in the cockpit running through his pre-flight checks. He had been flying commercial routes for 15 years, and this particular run was as routine as they came. He knew every switch and button in the cockpit, and he could fly this route with his eyes closed if necessary. After finishing his checks, he stood up and straightened his uniform. He liked to walk through the cabin before takeoff to greet passengers and shake hands with a few people. It made them feel safe and reassured them that they were in good hands. He stepped out of the cockpit and started making his way down the aisle with a practiced smile on his face. He stopped to chat with the businessman about the lunar market conditions. He complimented the young couple on their baby and wished them a pleasant flight. He told the college students to enjoy their trip and reminded them to keep their seatbelts fastened during takeoff. As he walked, he scanned the faces of the passengers with the careful eye of someone who had done this job for many years. When he reached row 12, his eyes fell on Maya Collins sitting quietly with her tablet. He paused beside her seat and looked down at her with a slight frown. Something about her bothered him, though he could not quite put his finger on what it was. She looked young, and she was dressed casually like many of the other passengers, but there was something that made him want to take a closer look. Maya sensed his presence and looked up from her tablet with a polite but questioning expression. She wondered why he was standing there staring at her when he had just walked past a dozen other passengers without stopping. Captain Hayes cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that was loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. He told her that he needed to see her identification. Maya was puzzled because she had already shown her ID during the boarding process at the gate. She asked him if there was a problem, and he replied that it was just company policy to do random security checks. His tone suggested that this was more than just a routine procedure. Maya reached into her bag and pulled out her standard civilian ID card. She handed it to him without any fuss because she had nothing to hide. Captain Hayes took the card and examined it closely, turning it over several times as if he was looking for signs of forgery or tampering. He held it up to the light and squinted at the holographic seal. The seconds ticked by and other passengers began to notice what was happening. The businessman across the aisle looked over with interest. The young couple 2 rows ahead turned around to see what was causing the delay. Captain Hayes finally spoke again and said that the ID did not look right to him. Maya felt a flush of anger rising up her neck, but she kept her voice calm and level. She assured him that the ID was completely valid and offered to let him scan it with his device if he wanted to verify it. The captain continued to hold the card as if it was a piece of evidence in a crime. He said that he had seen plenty of fake IDs in his time, and that young people were always trying to sneak onto restricted flights using credentials they had not earned. His words hung in the air like an accusation. Maya could feel the eyes of other passengers on her now, and she knew exactly what was happening. She had experienced this kind of treatment before in different forms in different places. It always followed the same pattern, and it always made her feel the same mix of anger and frustration. But she had learned long ago that losing her temper only made things worse, so she took a slow, deep breath and kept her composure. She told the captain that the ID was legitimate and that she had already passed through 3 security checkpoints to get on this shuttle. Each checkpoint had scanned her ID and verified her identity without any problems. Captain Hayes crossed his arms over his chest and said that those checkpoints could be fooled. He said that he was responsible for this vessel and everyone on it, and that he needed to verify that every passenger had the right to be here. His voice had taken on a self-important tone, as if he was doing everyone a great service by being so thorough and careful. Maya looked directly at Captain Hayes and told him to go ahead and verify her identification. She said he could scan it or call ground control or do whatever he needed to do to satisfy himself that she was a legitimate passenger. Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it that made it clear she was not going to be intimidated. The captain seemed taken aback by her steady gaze and confident manner. He had expected her to become nervous or defensive, but instead she was challenging him to follow through with his accusations. The man in the business suit across the aisle leaned forward and asked if there was a problem. His name was Paul Henderson, and he was a senior executive at one of the lunar mining companies. Captain Hayes turned to him and said he was just ensuring everyone's safety and that you could not be too careful these days. His words sounded reasonable on the surface, but there was an edge to his voice that suggested he was uncomfortable with being questioned. Paul Henderson sat back in his seat, but he continued to watch the interaction with a concerned expression. Other passengers were also paying attention now, and the cabin had grown quieter as people tuned in to what was happening in row 12. Maya could feel the weight of their stares, and she knew that some of them were probably wondering if she really was a security threat. That was how these situations worked, and she understood the psychology of it. When an authority figure singles someone out and treats them with suspicion, it plants seeds of doubt in the minds of observers, even if there is no legitimate reason for that suspicion. Captain Hayes was still holding her ID card as if it was evidence of some crime. He studied it again with exaggerated care, and then looked at Maya with narrowed eyes. He asked her what kind of consultant she was because her ID listed her occupation as consultant. Maya told him that she worked in security consulting, but she did not elaborate beyond that. The captain snorted and said that security consulting was pretty vague and could mean almost anything. He wanted to know what kind of security work she did and why she was traveling to Horizon 7. Maya replied that her work was confidential and that she was not at liberty to discuss the details with him or anyone else. This answer clearly did not satisfy Captain Hayes, and his face began to redden with frustration. He said that he had the right to know what kind of passenger he was carrying on his shuttle, especially if that passenger was involved in sensitive security work. Maya remained seated with her hands folded calmly in her lap. She told him that he had verified her identity through the boarding process, and that her clearance level confirmed she was authorized to be on this flight. That was all the information he was entitled to under federal regulations. Her knowledge of the regulations seemed to irritate the captain even more. A flight attendant named Carla Martinez approached them with a nervous expression on her face. She was young and new to the job, and she clearly did not want to get involved in whatever was happening between the captain and this passenger. She told Captain Hayes that they were already 5 minutes behind schedule, and that they really needed to complete the boarding process and prepare for departure. The captain ignored her and continued to focus on Maya. He said that the more he thought about it, the less comfortable he was with the whole situation. There was something about Maya that did not sit right with him, and he thought it would be better if she took the next shuttle instead. That way they would have time to run a more thorough background check and make sure everything was in order. The cabin erupted in murmurs and whispers. Paul Henderson stood up and said that this was ridiculous, and that you could not just kick someone off a flight because you did not like their answers. Other passengers nodded in agreement, and a few people pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Captain Hayes raised his voice and said that this was his vessel, and that he had final authority over who flew on it. He had the right to remove any passenger if he felt their presence posed a risk to the safety and security of the flight. Maya sat perfectly still and spoke in a quiet voice that somehow cut through all the noise and commotion. She said that she was not leaving the shuttle. The captain stared at her in disbelief and said that if she refused to leave voluntarily, then he would have security remove her by force. Maya met his gaze without flinching and told him that she would not recommend taking that course of action. Her words were soft, but there was steel underneath them. Captain Hayes was getting more flustered by the second, and he demanded to know if she was threatening him. Maya shook her head and said she was not threatening anyone. She was simply advising him that removing her from this flight would be a very poor decision and one that would have significant consequences for his career. The captain laughed, but it sounded forced and uncertain. He said that he had been flying for 15 years without a single complaint, and that one disgruntled passenger was not going to change anything. He had a spotless record and the full support of his company. Maya did not respond to his boast, and instead she sat quietly waiting for him to make his next move. Carla tried again to convince the captain to let the matter drop and get the flight underway. She pointed out that Maya had passed through multiple security checkpoints, and that her ID had been verified by station security personnel who were trained professionals. Surely that was enough to establish that she was not a threat. But Captain Hayes was too far into the confrontation to back down now, and his pride would not let him admit that he might be wrong. Captain Hayes turned to Carla and ordered her to call station security immediately. He wanted them to send officers to escort this uncooperative passenger off the shuttle, so they could finally get underway. Carla hesitated because she could see that the situation was spiraling out of control, and she had a bad feeling about where it was headed. But Captain Hayes was her superior, and she had to follow his orders even if she disagreed with them. She reached for her communicator, but before she could activate it, Maya stood up from her seat. The movement was smooth and unhurried, but there was something about it that made everyone in the cabin pay attention. Captain Hayes took an involuntary step backward, even though Maya was not particularly tall or physically imposing. She was maybe 5 feet 6 inches, but there was a quality in her posture now that commanded respect. Maya spoke in a clear voice that carried through the entire cabin. She told the captain that before he called security there was something he needed to see. She reached into her jacket with slow, deliberate movements, keeping her hands visible so no one would think she was reaching for a weapon. Her fingers closed around a leather wallet and she pulled it out carefully. With a practiced flip of her wrist, she opened the wallet to reveal what was inside. The gold badge caught the overhead lights and seemed to glow against the black leather background. The letters FBI were emblazoned across the top of the badge in bold letters that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Beneath the badge was her official identification card with her photograph, and her full title printed in clear text. The cabin went completely silent, as if someone had hit a mute button. Captain Hayes stared at the badge with his mouth hanging open and no sound coming out. Carla gasped and put her hand over her mouth. Paul Henderson let out a low whistle of surprise. The other passengers leaned forward in their seats, trying to get a better look at what Maya was holding. She spoke in a professional voice that had an edge of steel running through it. She identified herself as Special Agent Maya Collins of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Interplanetary Division. She explained that she was traveling to Horizon 7 on official federal business and that she had been assigned to investigate a series of incidents involving passenger profiling and discrimination on commercial spaceflights. Her words hung in the air like thunderclaps. Captain Hayes seemed to shrink inside his uniform and all the color drained from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. Finally, he managed to stammer that he did not know who she was or what she was doing on his flight. Maya continued in the same calm, professional tone. She said that of course he did not know, because that was the entire point of an undercover operation. She had been traveling on various commercial shuttle routes for the past 6 weeks, gathering evidence and documenting cases of discrimination. This particular shuttle line had received 17 formal complaints in the past 6 months, and every single one of them involved passengers who were women or people of color or both. The complaints all followed the same pattern, with passengers being subjected to additional screening or questioning, or in some cases removal from flights after they had already passed through official security protocols. Maya let her words sink in while she kept her badge visible for everyone to see. Several passengers were now recording the confrontation on their devices, and she was fine with that, because she wanted documentation of what was happening. Captain Hayes tried to defend himself by saying that he was just doing his job and trying to keep the flight safe. His voice had lost all its authority, and now he just sounded desperate and afraid. Maya asked him a simple question. She wanted to know what specific threat she had posed to the safety of the flight. What about her appearance or her behavior had suggested that she was dangerous or untrustworthy? Was it the way she had been sitting quietly in her seat reading files on her tablet? Or was it something else entirely? She did not need to spell out what that something else was, because everyone in the cabin understood exactly what she meant. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Carla found her voice and spoke up in support of what Maya had said. She told everyone that Captain Hayes had done this kind of thing before on previous flights. 3 weeks ago, he had delayed a flight for 40 minutes because he claimed a passenger's credentials looked suspicious. The passenger in question had been a doctor from Lagos who was Traveling to a medical conference on Mars, the doctor had all the proper documentation and had been cleared by security. But Captain Hayes had insisted on running additional checks. Before that incident, there had been another one involving a woman from Beijing who was traveling to visit her daughter at one of the research stations. Captain Hayes had questioned her extensively about her visa paperwork, even though it had been approved by 2 different government agencies. Carla said she had wanted to report these incidents, but she was new to the job and afraid of losing her position if she spoke up against a senior captain. Maya assured Carla that she would not lose her job and that her testimony would be valuable in the investigation. Then she turned her attention back to Captain Hayes and told him that she was placing him under formal investigation. He would be required to complete this flight under her observation, and then he would be suspended pending a full review of his conduct and behavior. The captain found his voice again and protested that she could not do that to him. He said he had rights and that he was just being cautious in his duties as captain. Maya corrected Captain Hayes in a firm voice. She told him that there was a significant difference between being cautious about legitimate security concerns and engaging in discriminatory profiling of passengers. He had demonstrated a clear pattern of targeting specific individuals based on their race or gender or national origin. And that was not just a violation of company policy, but also a violation of federal law. The weight of her words seemed to press down on the captain like a physical force. He looked around the cabin as if searching for support or sympathy, but found none. The passengers who had been watching the confrontation now looked at him with expressions ranging from anger to disappointment. Even those who had not personally experienced discrimination could see what had been happening, and they did not approve. Paul Henderson stood up again and addressed the other passengers. He said that he had witnessed this kind of behavior before on commercial flights, but had never said anything because he figured it was not his place to get involved. Now he realized that his silence had been a form of complicity, and he was ashamed of it. He looked directly at Maya and thanked her for doing something about a problem that too many people preferred to ignore. His words seemed to open a floodgate, and other passengers began speaking up as well. A woman sitting 2 rows behind Maya said she had been questioned extensively on a previous flight about her reasons for traveling, even though her ticket and documentation were all in order. The questions had been invasive and embarrassing, and she had felt humiliated in front of the other passengers. A man near the front of the cabin mentioned that he had seen crew members pull aside passengers for additional screening, and that the people selected always seemed to fit a certain profile. They were never the white businessmen in expensive suits or the elderly couples on vacation. They were always younger passengers with darker skin or foreign-sounding names. The stories kept coming, and Maya listened carefully to each one while taking notes on her tablet. Every account would be valuable evidence for the investigation, and she wanted to make sure she captured all the details. Captain Hayes stood frozen in the aisle, looking smaller and more defeated with each testimony. He had probably never imagined that his actions were being noticed and discussed by so many people. Maya addressed the cabin and explained something important that she wanted everyone to understand. She said that not all security questioning was discriminatory or wrong. There were absolutely times when additional screening was necessary and appropriate for legitimate safety reasons. But that screening had to be based on specific objective criteria and actual suspicious behavior. It could not be based on someone's race or religion or gender or where they happened to be born, and it definitely could not happen after a passenger had already been cleared by multiple official security checkpoints, staffed by trained professionals. She turned to Carla and told her that she would need to file an official statement about what she had witnessed. Anyone else who had seen discriminatory behavior on these flights was also welcome to provide statements, and their cooperation would be noted and appreciated. Several passengers raised their hands immediately, volunteering to help with the investigation. Maya made note of their seat numbers and promised to follow up with each person individually after they arrived at Horizon 7. Captain Hayes finally managed to speak, though his voice came out weak and shaky. He said that this investigation was going to ruin him and destroy his career. Maya looked at him with an expression that was neither sympathetic nor cruel. She told him that his own actions were going to have consequences, and whether those consequences ruined him would depend on what he chose to do next. He had 2 options available to him. He could cooperate with the investigation and acknowledge what he had done wrong, and perhaps find a way to make amends and learn from his mistakes. Or he could deny everything and deflect blame onto others and make the situation much worse for himself in the long run. The choice was entirely his to make. The captain looked around the cabin one more time at all the faces watching him. Some passengers looked angry at what he had done. Others appeared disappointed that someone in a position of authority had abused that authority so badly. A few people actually seemed sympathetic, as if they understood that good people could sometimes do bad things without fully realizing it. But nobody was coming to his defense or offering to support his version of events. The evidence against him was simply too overwhelming and too clear. Maya told Captain Hayes that he needed to return to the cockpit and prepare the shuttle for departure. They were now 20 minutes behind schedule, and the passengers deserved to reach their destination without further delay. She would be monitoring his performance throughout the flight and taking note of how he conducted himself. The captain nodded mutely and walked back toward the cockpit with his shoulders slumped and his head down. He looked like a man who had just realized that his entire world was about to change in ways he had not anticipated. Carla and the other flight attendants began helping passengers settle back into their seats and preparing the cabin for takeoff. Maya returned to her seat and fastened her seatbelt as the shuttle prepared for departure. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed completely from what it had been just 30 minutes earlier. Passengers were talking quietly among themselves, and many of them kept glancing in her direction with expressions of respect and curiosity. She noticed that some people were still recording videos on their devices, and she knew that footage of the confrontation would probably be circulating on social media within hours. That was fine, because public awareness was an important part of creating change in systems that had allowed discrimination to flourish unchecked. The engines hummed to life and the shuttle began its taxi toward the launch pad. Through the small window beside her seat, Maya could see the sprawling complex of Earth's main orbital departure facility. Hundreds of shuttles came and went from this location every day, carrying passengers and cargo to destinations all across the solar system. It was an impressive testament to human achievement and technological progress, but that progress meant nothing if people were still being treated unfairly based on the color of their skin or where they came from. The takeoff was smooth, and within minutes they had left Earth's atmosphere behind and were accelerating toward Horizon 7. Maya pulled out her tablet again and continued reviewing the files she had been working on before the confrontation. The investigation into discriminatory practices on commercial spaceflights had begun 6 months ago, after a congressional committee received numerous complaints from passengers. The complaints had come from all the major shuttle lines, but certain companies and certain routes seemed to have more problems than others. Maya and her team had been tasked with documenting these incidents and building cases that could lead to policy changes and legal action where appropriate. She had flown undercover on dozens of flights during the past 6 weeks, and she had witnessed disturbing patterns. Passengers who were Black or Asian or Latino were far more likely to be subjected to additional questioning than white passengers, even when all other factors were identical. Women traveling alone were often treated with more suspicion than men. People with foreign accents or non-English names faced extra scrutiny, regardless of their actual citizenship or legal status. In many cases, the discrimination was subtle enough that individual passengers might doubt whether it had really happened, or whether they were just being oversensitive. But when you looked at the data across hundreds of flights, the patterns became unmistakable and impossible to ignore. Carla stopped by Maya's seat and asked if she needed anything. Maya thanked her and said she was fine. The flight attendant lingered for a moment and then said in a quiet voice that she was grateful for what Maya was doing. She explained that she had felt uncomfortable about Captain Hayes' behavior for weeks, but had not known how to address it without risking her job. Working in the commercial spaceflight industry was highly competitive, and there were always dozens of people waiting to take your position if you made trouble or caused problems. Maya understood the difficult position that Carla and others like her faced. She told the young woman that speaking up about discrimination should never put someone's job at risk and that there were laws in place to protect whistleblowers. Unfortunately, those laws were not always enforced as strongly as they should be, which was why investigations like this one were necessary. She encouraged Carla to document everything she had seen and to be prepared to testify if the case went to a formal hearing. Paul Henderson also came by to speak with Maya. He apologized for not intervening sooner when he saw what was happening. He said that he had become so accustomed to seeing this kind of behavior that it had started to seem normal, or at least not worth making a fuss about. Maya appreciated his honesty and told him that changing these patterns required everyone to be willing to speak up when they saw injustice. People with privilege and social standing had a particular responsibility to use their voices because they often faced fewer consequences for challenging authority. Paul nodded thoughtfully and promised that he would be more aware and more willing to act in the future. The 3-hour flight passed without any further incidents. Captain Hayes remained in the cockpit and did not make another appearance in the passenger cabin. The co-pilot handled most of the actual flying, while Hayes sat in stunned silence processing what had happened and what it meant for his future. Maya could only imagine what was going through his mind, but she felt no particular sympathy for him. He had made choices that had hurt other people, and now he was facing the consequences of those choices. That was how accountability worked, even though many people seemed to think they should be exempt from it. As they approached Horizon 7, Maya looked out the window at the massive orbital station. It was one of the largest human-made structures in space, with multiple arms extending out like the spokes of a wheel. Thousands of people lived and worked on the station, which served as a hub for travel to Mars and the outer planets. Ships arrived and departed at all hours, carrying passengers and supplies to destinations that previous generations could only have dreamed about. The docking procedure was complex, but the co-pilot handled it expertly, and they settled into their assigned berth with barely a bump. The seatbelt light turned off and passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Maya waited patiently as the cabin slowly emptied out. She wanted to give most people time to leave before she had her final conversation with Captain Hayes. When only a handful of passengers remained, she stood up and made her way toward the cockpit. The door was open and she could see Hayes sitting in the pilot's seat, staring blankly at the control panel. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the span of 3 hours. Maya knocked on the doorframe to announce her presence, and the captain slowly turned to look at her. His eyes were red and his face was pale and drawn. She told him that investigators from the FBI would be contacting him within the next 24 hours to begin formal interviews. She recommended that he consult with a union representative or legal counsel before making any statements. Whatever he said during those interviews would become part of the official record and could be used in any subsequent legal proceedings. Captain Hayes nodded but did not speak. Maya continued in a softer tone. She told him that she wanted him to think seriously about what had happened today and about the patterns of behavior that had led to this moment. This was an opportunity for him to reflect on his actions and his attitudes and to make meaningful changes if he was willing to do the work. The captain finally found his voice and said that he had never thought of himself as a racist or a bigot. He had always believed he treated everyone fairly and equally. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears because the evidence clearly contradicted that belief. Maya told him that very few people thought of themselves as prejudiced or discriminatory. Most people believed they were good and fair-minded individuals who judged others based on merit and character. But everyone had biases whether they acknowledged them or not. Those biases were shaped by culture and media, and personal experiences and countless other factors. What mattered was whether people recognized their biases and worked actively to overcome them, or whether they let those biases guide their decisions and actions. She said that Captain Hayes had let his biases hurt other people, and that was a serious problem. But it did not have to define the rest of his life if he was willing to take responsibility and make real changes. The captain looked down at his hands and asked what would happen to him. Maya explained that the investigation would take several weeks at minimum. He would be suspended from flying duties during that time, while investigators reviewed his record and interviewed witnesses. If the evidence supported formal charges, then he could face fines or permanent loss of his pilot's license, or even criminal prosecution, depending on the severity of the violations. If he cooperated fully and showed genuine remorse and understanding, then the consequences might be less severe. But there would definitely be consequences because his actions had violated both company policies and federal anti-discrimination laws. Hayes closed his eyes and took a shaky breath. He said he understood and that he would cooperate with the investigation. Maya nodded and told him that was a good first step. Then she left the cockpit and exited the shuttle. The docking area was bustling with activity as passengers from multiple flights moved through the corridors toward immigration and customs checkpoints. Maya joined the flow of people and made her way through the familiar process of showing her credentials and having her bag scanned. The security officers recognized her FBI badge and waved her through without the usual questions. She appreciated the efficiency, but she was also aware of the irony. She was being treated with deference and respect because of her badge, while ordinary passengers might face suspicion and additional screening based on nothing more than their appearance. That double standard was part of what she was working to change. After clearing security, Maya took a transport tube to the hotel section of the station. She had a room reserved in one of the mid-range hotels that catered to government employees and business travelers. The room was small but comfortable, with a bed and a desk and a window that looked out at the star-filled void of space. She dropped her bags and sat down at the desk to make some notes while the events of the flight were still fresh in her mind. She documented everything that Captain Hayes had said and done. She noted which passengers had offered to provide statements and what they had witnessed on this flight or previous ones. She made a list of follow-up questions she wanted to ask Carla and the other crew members. All of this information would be compiled into a detailed report that would become part of the official investigation file. As she worked, Maya thought about the bigger picture of what she was trying to accomplish. This investigation was not really about punishing Captain Hayes or any other individual pilot or crew member. It was about identifying systemic problems in how the commercial spaceflight industry operated and creating pressure for meaningful reform. The 17 complaints that had triggered this investigation were probably just the tip of the iceberg, because most people who experienced discrimination never filed formal complaints. They just accepted it as an unpleasant reality of travel and moved on with their lives. Maya listened carefully to everything Carla said and took detailed notes. She explained that fear of retaliation was one of the main reasons discrimination continued in workplaces, and that companies had legal obligations to protect employees who reported misconduct. If Carla faced any negative consequences for cooperating with this investigation, then that would itself be a violation of federal law and would result in additional charges against the company. Carla seemed relieved to hear this, and some of the tension left her shoulders. They talked for another hour, covering every detail that Carla could remember. When they were finished, Maya thanked her for her courage and told her that she would be in touch as the investigation progressed. Carla left the cafe looking more confident than when she had arrived. Maya sat alone for a few more minutes, finishing her coffee and thinking about what she had learned. The picture that was emerging was not pretty, but it was consistent with what she had seen on other shuttle lines. There seemed to be a culture in the commercial spaceflight industry that tolerated or even encouraged discrimination, as long as it was dressed up in the language of security and safety. Over the next several days, Maya conducted interviews with the passengers who had witnessed the incident on the shuttle. Each person provided valuable testimony that corroborated what she had observed and what Carla had reported. Paul Henderson was particularly helpful, because he had flown frequently for business and had seen similar incidents on multiple occasions. He admitted that he had not paid much attention to these patterns until they were pointed out to him, but now that he was aware, he could see how pervasive the problem was. A woman named Lisa Chen, who had been sitting near the back of the shuttle, described how relieved she had felt when Maya revealed her badge. Lisa had experienced discrimination on previous flights and had started to believe that nothing would ever change. Seeing someone in authority actually hold a pilot accountable gave her hope that the system could be reformed. Maya also interviewed several crew members from other flights who had heard about what happened and wanted to share their own experiences. The stories they told were disturbingly similar to what Carla had described: pilots and senior crew members engaging in discriminatory behavior, while junior employees felt powerless to stop it. Company management either ignoring complaints or actively discouraging people from making them. A corporate culture that valued avoiding bad publicity over addressing legitimate problems. All of this information was carefully documented and added to the growing case file. Maya knew that building a strong case would take time and patience, but she was committed to seeing it through. Too many people had suffered from discrimination for too long, and it was time for meaningful change. On her fourth day at Horizon 7, Maya had her meeting with the station administrator. His name was Gregory Palmer, and he was a career bureaucrat who had spent 20 years working in various administrative positions throughout the solar system. He greeted Maya warmly and offered her coffee before they sat down to discuss the investigation. Palmer expressed his concern about the discrimination complaints and said he wanted to do everything possible to ensure that Horizon 7 was a safe and welcoming place for all travelers. Maya appreciated his words, but she was more interested in concrete actions. She asked what measures the station had in place to monitor and prevent discriminatory behavior by shuttle crews and station personnel. Palmer admitted that current oversight was minimal and largely reactive. The station responded to complaints when they were filed, but did not have proactive systems for identifying patterns or preventing problems before they occurred. Maya suggested implementing several reforms, including mandatory anti-discrimination training for all personnel who interacted with passengers, random audits of security screening procedures, and an independent oversight board to review complaints. Palmer agreed that these were good ideas and promised to work with her to develop implementation plans. They discussed logistics and timelines for about an hour before Maya left his office, feeling cautiously optimistic. The meeting had gone better than she expected, and Palmer seemed genuinely interested in making changes rather than just paying lip service to the issue. Later that afternoon, Maya boarded another shuttle for an undercover observation flight. This time she was traveling to one of the Mars research stations on a different shuttle line. She wanted to see if the problems she had documented were limited to one company, or if they were more widespread throughout the industry. The flight was uneventful and she did not witness any obvious discrimination, but she made careful notes about procedures and interactions between crew and passengers. Over the following weeks, Maya continued her investigation, traveling on multiple routes and documenting what she observed. Some flights were fine with professional crews who treated all passengers with respect and courtesy. Other flights showed clear evidence of discriminatory practices, with certain passengers being singled out for additional scrutiny based on their appearance. Each observation added to the growing body of evidence and strengthened the case for systemic reform. 3 months after the incident with Captain Hayes, Maya submitted her final report to FBI headquarters. The report was over 200 pages long and included testimony from dozens of witnesses, analysis of complaint patterns across multiple shuttle lines, and specific recommendations for policy changes and enforcement actions. The report concluded that discrimination was a significant and widespread problem in the commercial spaceflight industry, and that immediate action was needed to protect passengers and ensure equal treatment under the law.